Hey guys, welcome back to Wall Builders here, doing the Room Schoolhouse. We apologize for technical difficulties. I don't know if it was China or Russia. Somebody's hacking us. It's ridiculous. Actually, it's just bad internet connection. So we're hoping to get this posted for you guys to see very quickly. As we are going on this week, we're looking at some of the effects of coronavirus. And specifically, we think there's going to be a lot of positive resets that happen when we get past all of kind of the nonsense we're still dealing with. And I say nonsense because as we look at the pandemic, we're pretending like this is the first time we've ever had a pandemic in America. And the reality is, not only is this not the first pandemic, this is not even one of the more deadly pandemics we've had in America.
Yeah, we average in America a pandemic about once every 15 years, a medical pandemic once every 15 years or so. And if you look at the death rate, mortality rate in America right now, it's about 1/100th of 1%. So it's about 200 deaths per million Americans. If you want to look at mortality rates in history, go back to 1633, take the...
And by the way, saying there's 200 deaths per million, now those numbers are being questioned largely.
That's true, yeah.
Because are we overcounting? We've seen, right, Colorado and Pennsylvania states that have had to go back and redo their numbers. And so there's no doubt this is a deadly pandemic. There's no doubt that lives are being lost. It's just, it seems like there might be some exaggeration, almost as if the federal government said, hey, we're going to give hospitals money if you have coronavirus death. And then hospitals are like, oh yeah, we've had a lot of those, but maybe not quite as deadly as the numbers indicate, at least right now.
Well, even right now, corona is only the 8th leading cause of death in America now. So it's not like it's the big thing. It's the big news thing this year. But if you go back and look at mortality rates with the 200 out of every million right now, or 1/100th of 1%. Go back to 1633, smallpox epidemic, mortality rate was 70%. Wow. So that's in a nation of 330 million, we're talking like 240 million would be dead now if this were like 1633. If you take the city that's been hit the hardest, it's got to be New York City, hands down. Their death rate is 0.2 of 1%, or one death out of every 500 New York citizens, or New York City citizens. But if you go to something like the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 in Philadelphia, mortality rate was 25%. So this is not even close to that.
And we do have stuff from the yellow fever. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah, all the way back when we started this.
Several weeks ago, back when the coronavirus shutdown was just kind of unfolding. And we'll come back to that in a minute because there's a really interesting letter from Jefferson dealing with the yellow fever epidemic. But that was certainly a deadly epidemic in American history. Mass casualty, Philadelphia. Huge percentage of their population was devastated.
Well, if you take and go forward from that, you have, and by the way, we had several yellow fever epidemics, not just in 1793, but 1800, and there were different cities that got hit hard. You also had cholera epidemics in the early 1800s, first half, 3 major cholera epidemics. You had a scarlet fever epidemic in the late 1850s. You had a number of other epidemics. You had diphtheria, you had typhoid, lots of flu. If you go to 1918, the Spanish flu in 1918, that one killed 675,000 Americans, about 50 million worldwide. We're nowhere close to that
50 million worldwide. And that's also when world population, American population, much smaller.
About half of what
so,
it is
yeah,
now.
670,000 people. That's huge percentage.
That's huge.
50 million of the world? Astronomical compared to where we are today.
That's right. So you take the 1918 Spanish flu, or you can go to the 1957 Asian flu, still a smaller population in America, 116,000 Americans died. Wow. Or you can go to the Hong Kong flu of 1968, 100,000 Americans died. Or you can go to 2009, the swine flu. Or you can also look at all the measles epidemics throughout the 20th century that were massive. Or you can look at about 35 years of a polio epidemic.
So I'm getting the feeling pandemics have been around for a while.
Lots of history.
This is not the first one, and we're going to talk about how we think there's going to be some positive resets on the backside, but even in all these pandemics, we never saw a government operate the way we are now. And to clarify, it's not the federal government that has overstepped and violated so many boundaries. We'll probably talk about that later this week, but state governors, state governments have done so much. And when you look at previous pandemics, generally what would happen is you would quarantine people who were sick, but people who weren't sick got to continue to go to work and they got to live their life and they got to go to church and do their normal things. But now we're saying, no, we're going to quarantine all the population, everybody, unless you're essential, and essential has now become a little bit relative how we define that. So going back to the yellow fever epidemic, So Benjamin Rush was a signer of the Declaration. He helped ratify the Constitution, served in the first 3 presidential administrations. This is his account of the yellow fever epidemic. He was one of the doctors in Philadelphia when yellow fever hits, and most medical professionals, most people with money left the city because they didn't want to die. He stayed behind because he knew that it was appointed the man once to die, as he believed the Bible taught. And he thought, I'm going to stay here and be useful as long as I can be useful. I want to serve the people, because as a Christian, he thought you should do that. There was a pastor who joined with him, Richard Allen. This is Richard Allen's account. And in the front of this, it has not only his account, but down here, it also mentions containing a narrative of the yellow fever epidemic, which he helped Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia in the middle of that yellow fever epidemic. As this is going on, a lot of the nation is responding, and even several years later, Thomas Jefferson has a letter recounting a little bit of his thoughts to Benjamin Rush.
Because Jefferson actually stayed in the city of Philadelphia.
And by the way, Philadelphia was the nation's
national
capital.
Biggest city in America, I think,
right.
at the time, and I think the second biggest English-speaking city in the world at that period. And so Thomas Jefferson stays in the city as well during that time, but another yellow fever epidemic actually breaks out in 1800, and he writes to his friend Benjamin Rush, who was there in that 1793 epidemic. But Jefferson actually takes a very kind of unique and interesting perspective to some of these natural disasters. And he writes to Rush, and he says, I'm in the habit of looking out for what good may arise from them, the bad things that happen, as consolations to us. And Providence has in fact so established the order of things as that most evils are the means of producing some good. Now that's a very interesting perspective to take, especially about something like a yellow fever epidemic, and it's kind of almost a biblical thought, going back to what is that, Romans?
Yeah, Romans 8:28. Yeah, that we know that God causes all things to work together for good for those that love Him, that are called according to His purpose. And so that's exactly what Thomas Jefferson tells Rush is we know that even in these bad things, he says, I've just kind of made up my mind, I'm going to look for the good that will come out of bad things, which we know is one of the promises from Scripture, is what God helps do for people that love Him or called according to His purpose. And so if we look at right now coronavirus and say, well, what good might come of this? We can look at the devastated economy. We can look at obviously so many people's retirements and their finances that have been devastated. I mean, there's so many things we could look at and say,
by the way,
been problems.
There's also some unintended consequences that are devastating. As unemployment's gone up, we have the economic problems. Unemployment's going up. We know that for every 1% that national unemployment goes up, suicides go up 1.6%. So in addition to the COVID deaths, because of all this isolation, all the fear and loss of job, we're looking at somewhere between 18,000 and 45,000 additional suicides on top of what happens every year.
Yeah,
so there's lots of tragedy.
That's predicted. That's not even including some of the military lives that we have several friends very engaged in helping really guys struggling with PTSD that are trying to readjust and normalize their life. And they say, look, they're not being able to visit their counselors. They know of many guys. They think the numbers are actually rising of military suicides. And so there's a lot of problems we look at and recognize, okay, there's some really bad things that have happened, but we know Scripture's true. We know that God can bring good out of terrible situations, which is what Thomas Jefferson wrote to Benjamin Rush. So the question would be, then what good things maybe could we look and think that there might be some positive outcomes coming in the midst of all of the shutdowns? We know people have been frustrated by losing some of their rights, by losing some of their freedoms and their privileges. And so we think there will be several positive things coming out of it, maybe in the areas of education. We talked about there might be some things. There might be some positive things.
Just this week, we've seen numbers showing that 40% of parents think, I'm going to homeschool. My kids have been home. I've been doing stuff.
Conversation.
They're having that conversation now. Whether that holds up next September, we'll see. But already there's a rethinking going on. And certainly there's the idea that, we didn't need all these buildings that we've been paying billions for. We've done all right. Maybe we ought to rethink the way we do education.
Yeah, and so the stat of 40%, it's not that they're saying that they are going to homeschool, but 40% are now considering homeschooling, recognizing whatever benefits there might be, online courses, online curriculum, they get to maybe have more time with the family. So 40% of the nation is now thinking about a new form of education, which could have a lot of positive effects, because we know even though there are some great teachers in the public school educational facility, there's some great administrators, there's some great superintendents and principals, there's great people there. It is very much a broken system in a lot of areas. And what it has produced in so many areas is not good. We don't teach civics largely anymore. Now, there might be 1 or 2 school districts here, but I think it's only 3% of schools that have civics education.
Only 3% of colleges offer civics courses anymore.
Okay. So most students come out, they don't know even the 3 branches of government. They don't know the freedoms of the Bill of Rights, specifically the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. There's a lot of things that you should know.
It's right. Knowing the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment would be especially helpful right now when you see those freedoms get taken away from you.
Absolutely. And so those 5 freedoms, right, you have religion, you have speech, you have press, assembly, and you have petition. And 4 of those 5 have been shut down by many governors, where people say, nope, you can't meet in churches, you can't have the freedom of speech, you can't assemble in crowds together, you can't come and protest or petition your government for redress of grievances. But the one thing they haven't stopped is the media. It's interesting, the media has a very loud voice. Oftentimes they're on the side of these liberal governors. So it's interesting, the media is the only one of those 5 that has not been shut down. But yeah, so we're seeing public schools that have failed in a lot of areas.
And one of the things that happens is just the fact that we're having a conversation that 40% are considering it will cause public schools to look at what do we need to do different. This always increases competition. We're a firm believer that competition always raises all boats. And so education will be better just from the conversations about what do we need to do to get better. But we also think that constitutionally there's going to be some major things happening, because already people are talking about these freedoms in the First Amendment, 4 of the 5. Only 1 out of 1,000 Americans can name the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. Now they're becoming aware of what those freedoms are. They're seeing them violated. They're getting together to have these rallies, open the state. And it's interesting that as we see polling right now, generally the older you are, the more you know about the Constitution. But polling shows that among millennials is where the highest concern is for the violation of constitutional rights. Now that
You're welcome, guys.
Thank you for stepping up.
Yeah, generally we don't like to be told no and told we can't do things, right? And so this notion that the government's going to tell us that we can't go to a park, that we can't go to the beach, right? That we can, all these things that seem nonsensical, especially when there's so many reports of conflicting data where some people say, no, don't wear masks. That's not beneficial. Go outside. That's the best thing to do, right? All these things that we are hearing that seem to contradict what some of these governors are doing. So maybe a reset constitutionally, probably a reset even maybe when it comes to religious liberty. We might talk more about that later this week. But probably with churches, you'll see probably some reset there. We know numbers have showed that more people are reading the Bible, that more people have been getting involved in prayer. In fact, one of the Google search results said that prayer was the most searched for in the pandemic that it's ever been searched for. People looking, how do I pray and how does prayer work? People are actually engaging more in faith in a lot of levels than they have before the pandemic. So a lot of positive things when it comes to religion. So education, Constitution,
economics
religion.
is going to be a set because of what's happening, shutting down the economy. There's going to be discussions about that. We'll probably talk about it later this week with constitutional rights. Do you have a right to have a job or to work if you have a job? So is that a constitutional right? Because that's a discussion now. And what we're going to see probably as we move forward to November, which is always election season, this year is presidential election season, you're going to see a clear choice made, because one side's going to say, you know what, government didn't do enough. We should have nationalized the businesses and made masks and made more ventilators. And we should have nationalized the economy and we should have given every American a paycheck. We should have nationalized, and it's going to be, we needed more government to solve this. And the other side's going to say, no, we had way too much government as it was. So you're going to see that decision. And if that happens, you're going to have a choice between a real clear decision on, do you want more socialism in the economy or do you want more free market? And so this is a discussion that's been going for years, and people think socialism's really a pretty good deal. And now they're seeing the government take over the economy, and they're not sure they like that anymore. So I think even economically, we're going to have major discussions on moving away from the concept of socialism.
And I think even looking forward to November and the elections, we can actually look back to the past. You mentioned the Spanish flu pandemic in the early 1900s, 1918, 1919. And what happened then is actually, I think, probably the most parallel we've seen in America's history with what's going on today, because you actually saw some states closed down a lot. Some cities closed down a lot. Movie theaters, which were a new thing back then, maybe you remember.
Thank you very much.
They were closed during that time, and you saw a lot of economic downturn. And at that point, you're kind of at the height of the progressive movement, right? You have the very progressive President Woodrow Wilson, really making a big push towards globalism. So you see a lot of the same themes happening back then. And what happened when, right, the
1920 election.
Yep, 1920 election.
You had a real clear choice.
Real clear choice. And in that election, they went towards the very conservative ticket of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. And in fact, the difference between that election, between the progressive choice and the conservative choice, was the widest margin of victory ever in a presidential election. I think it was 26% more.
26% margin on the popular vote.
Between the two. And then, of course, the
nearly 280 electoral colleges.
So it was a wipeout in favor of constitutional rights after the American people experienced some of their rights getting taken away, which is maybe an encouraging kind of weather vane for going forward to 2020 in November.
Yeah, and so this is something that certainly, that doesn't mean all of these resets might happen, but the fact that we're now able to have some of these conversations where people are going, okay, wait a second, is that right? Should we be doing this? We can have honest conversations, which for a while we haven't been in a place where people wanted to have honest conversations.
And by the way, honest conversations also give an honest opportunity for education. What are our constitutional rights? What is the role of government? What should the federal government do? What should states do? What should governors do? There are clear constitutional. We haven't had those kind of discussions in a long time. So regardless of where the people choose, at least we now have the opportunity to return to some discussions we need.
Yeah, and that's why we think there could be some really positive resets that come out of this, because when you have honest conversations, people looking for answers, they didn't like where we were, you can actually change things back maybe the way they should have been, getting back to some more of the founders' intent, certainly some biblical ideas in some of this as well. And so wherever you are, maybe you're in a place that you're going, man, I'm praying for this so much to be over. Maybe you're pretty secure and feel good about it. Wherever you are, we are certainly praying for God to help usher us into a different era quickly, that God brings stability to our family, that God helps you where you are. Every morning with our staff, we're praying for everybody out there that God would just help families right where they are. And so wherever you are, we are praying for you. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the comment box, but we do think there's a great potential for a reset coming. This week, we're going to spend a little more time talking about what some of those resets might be.
I'm Leah Carowin of the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation. I just want to encourage you, if you're a legislator, the Pro-Family Legislative Conference that David Barton and the Wall Builders and Tim Barton put on, you need to be at this conference. This is one of the best conferences of the year. If you are interested at all in family legislation, if you're interested in religious freedom legislation, all of the things that ground and make our nation and your state stronger, this is the place to find out the most current, the most relevant, positive policies and legislation. Find out what's happening in other states. Work with like-minded legislators who are also working on the same thing. You get fantastic ideas. You get actual, step-by-step guides of how to get it done in your state. You get mock legislation. We don't miss this conference. I'm here every single year. It not only feeds your mind, but it feeds the soul too, because they have a time here where they encourage you in your faith, they encourage you in all the things that matter, that really strengthen you. You leave here empowered, you leave here equipped, you leave here ready to go back to your state and really make an impact.
It's life-changing. It will literally change the way that you think, the way that you act, because when you're taught truth, you can't help but be accountable for your choices.
And this is an amazing place to learn. These are amazing people to learn from. And just the foundation that you gain from the knowledge. And because like they said repeatedly, like you're planting seeds. They planted a whole forest in my head, and I cannot wait to go out and explore and continue the research that I started here.
Your soul will be affected to the point where you'll have a new thirst for knowledge, a new thirst for making yourself a better person as far as aspiring to higher virtues and to morality. But when you come here and you hold these documents or you hold these artifacts, you hold these weapons, suddenly they take on a new meaning, and that meaning inspires you.
My name is Elijah O'Neill. I am 20 years old. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. They should come to this program if they love truth. If they love the idea of upholding principles and the principles that made this nation great. The scripture in Proverbs that talks about he who walks with the wise will become wise, but the companion of fools suffers much harm. And I think about Tim Barton and David Barton on how these men are super wise, and for 2 weeks I've had the chance to walk with them as they show me history using primary source documents. And not only do they have an abundance in knowledge, but they have an abundance in wisdom because they've understood how to apply that knowledge. And being able to come here and learn from them has just been an incredible experience. It's something I'm going to take with me the rest of my life, and it's just made me more valiant and braver to stand up for what I know is right because I know truth. I would tell people to come because truth is worth it. Truth is something that is not easily found in this generation, and it's here. And so if you are a believer in Christ, if you want your faith reaffirmed or strengthened, come here because it will teach you how to be a warrior for Christ.